right, guys, this week we are going to be talking about comic books, which is one of my favorite topics. I came into comic books later in my life. I didn't actually really start looking into them until, I don't know, I was probably 21 or so. But then they have had a massive impact on me. And so I love talking about them. I love talking about their influence in culture, and so I hope that I can share my enthusiasm with you today. Um, One of my favorite shows in all time is The Big Bang Theory. And of course, they go visit the comic book store all the time if you've ever watched that show. But if you haven't, it's about um, academics that are all friends and they're very geeky and nerdy. Anyways, I love these two scenes. One is on the right hand side, you see Sheldon Cooper, he's the main character, and he says, "Oh, the smell of new comic books." And he's so excited, like that he walks in and like there's these new comic books there and he can like just smell them. And then on the left, it says, "It's amazing how many supervillains have advanced degrees. Graduate school should do a better job of screening those people out." And uh, when I was getting my PhD, I always referenced this because I just thought it was so funny, that there are all these doctors that are villains, and that's why I was getting mine. But with that, just to kind of reiterate, I of course love the comic book movies. I've been a fan of the cartoons for a long time. And then I got into reading the comics as well. But just a little background, Captain America is my favorite superhero. If you ever come visit me in my office, I have a Captain America shield on my door. I have, like, I guess the best way to describe it would be a shrine in my office to Captain America and the Winter Soldier. And he's just I just love what he stands for. I love his character and I love his story arcs. But I have two sons, and they are both named after superheroes. So the first one is Philip Stark. He's named after Iron Man. And then my second son is William Parker, and he's named after Spider Man. And so, again, they've had just an impact on my life. I really enjoyed them. And I think you can learn a lot from comics, especially when it comes to visual storytelling. So, why are they important? If you are not a comic book fan, you probably don't understand like the bigness and the vastness that goes into it. The storylines, I mean, they've been going since like the 1920s. Um, they've continued the storylines from there. There's thousands of characters, and it doesn't even have to be about the superheroes. I mean, there are comic books about characters like Archie and Jughead and Betty and Veronica, and comics that you see in the newspaper like Garfield, or things like that. um Comic books are not just about superheroes. That we have dark comics, you have graphic novels, all sorts of different things. And we're going to kind of talk about all of those concepts into one. And I will use visuals from superhero comics because those are my favorite. But there is a large, large subsection of what a comic book or a graphic novel contains, that goes into this lecture. But basically, comic books are very unique. They're a blend of art and narrative. Um, they are a very powerful medium for storytelling because you don't necessarily have to have long paragraphs of text to say what's going on. The visuals do that for you. They introduce a lot of innovative visual storytelling techniques. You can do a lot with the design of a comic book panel, with the character and their expressions. And there's just not one way to tell a story. You can do it in so many unique ways. Um, you have to have a lot of visual cues to help guide the story along. Color really makes a big impact in comic books. Emotion is done through the way characters look, through the colors that they wear, how the page is set up. So it's all very, very visual. Um, Comic books actively engage readers through the gutter effect, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. They explore diverse themes and represent a lot of marginalized voices. Especially now, we have really started expanding in that area in the last couple of decades, and they have always been very socially relevant. And then, last but not least, comic book adaptations like film and TV just continue to innovate and evolve and create an even more bigger fan base, a new area for us to go with it. And they expand on the visual storytelling of the actual comic book or graphic novel medium. Now, I, of course, apparently am a big fan of Marvel comics. I like some DC characters, and of course, there are all sorts of graphic novels that are really good as well. Um, but one of the big players in comics was Stan Lee. And there are tons and tons and tons of interviews with Stan Lee. There's lots of documentaries about superheroes and comics and graphic novels and how to illustrate them and all these things. Um, so much so that there wasn't like one video that like explained everything like I try to find. But I wanted to do kind of a mashup of an interview that he did that explains kind of like what the importance of comic books are, and then we'll go into it. So here you go.
I think probably the appeal of comics is A, you're reading a story, and if it's a story you like, the type of story you like, you're halfway home. But B, you can also look at the pictures while you're reading the story. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's no good. It doesn't give your imagination a reason to grow and develop. I think that's nonsense for this reason. Shakespeare wrote plays. Should you never see one on the stage? Because then you're seeing what he wrote and your imagination isn't visualizing it. Maybe we shouldn't have stage plays. Maybe we should just read his scripts. You go to see a movie. Maybe you shouldn't go to the movie. Maybe you should just buy the screenplay. I mean, obviously, on the face of it, that's nonsense. Well, it's the same with a comic strip. A comic strip, in its own way, is like theater. You have the story, you have the illustrations. Steven Spielberg said to me once, incidentally, you may have realized by now, I'm the world's biggest name dropper. But he said to me once, you know, Stan, you and I do essentially the same thing, except my pictures move. There is nothing wrong with reading a story and looking at the pictures. It's a great way to be entertained. And it's a simple way if you don't want to wade through a 300-page book. If you just don't have the time, it doesn't mean. I don't know anybody who reads comics who doesn't read books. There is something called the Marvel method of writing comics, which is really the Stan Lee method. What happened was they had always been written scripted, the way a motion picture has a screenplay. And I used to write them that way. I'd write the script, give it to the artist, and he would draw it. But by the time we were doing Spider-Man and the Hulk and the Fantastic Four and Iron Man and Daredevil and Thor, I didn't even mention the X-Men and the X-Men. I couldn't write them fast enough. And these artists were so brilliant and they were so good at story themselves that I would say to the artist, look, this is the plot I want. And I would either tell them in a few words what the story was, or I would write an outline on a page or 2 pages or a few paragraphs. And I'd say, you go ahead and draw it any way you want. It doesn't matter. I'll put the words in and tie it all together. And they did that. And it worked out beautifully because the artist wasn't handicapped by or inhibited by my descriptions. The artist could tell the story visually any way he wanted. And once I got the pages back and I was looking at the drawings, it was so easy for me to pinpoint the dialogue and make it exactly fit the expression on the character's face and so forth. And I loved working that way. And I was the guy who put in all the sound effects. I would letter them in. And I had a way of working. If the illustration was... See, a writer has a lot of freedom. If the illustration was very beautiful, I put very little or no dialogue in because I wanted the illustration to show. If we had an area where you had a few panels that not much was going on and they weren't that interesting, I put in as much dialogue as I could and sound effects, and I spaced. See, I laid out the balloons too. I would put the balloons in such a way that they seemed to be part of the design, and they made the panel look more interesting than it was. Um, so working that way, it became known as the Marvel method. And now a lot of people were, I'd say probably as many people work that way as the original way now. There are still people who like to write their own script, and more power to them. But I love this system. You tell the artist what the story is, let him draw it any way he wants to, and then you put the dialogue and the captions in and exactly match the illustration that you have.
So what I really enjoy about like this part of the interview is just that one, he talks about comics are not like a way to keep people from reading, but they allow people to read quickly, right? They're visual, just like a play is. And second of all, I love the fact that he helped develop this idea that the illustrations and the visual aspects were what guided the story. Here's the story idea, take it from there, I'll fill in the rest. And that really is what has created this iconic visual storytelling medium. And it has just done so much, not only with, you know, comic books and graphic novels, but in general, like with cartoons and cinema and lots of other things. It has become a base to really elevate visual storytelling. So, a brief history of comic books. We won't get into it too far, but they started in the 19th century as an early form of comics. They were seen as characters and satire in newspapers and magazines. Specifically, in 1895, we saw The Yellow Kid, which was a reoccurring comic strip and really kind of dug into what we call the age of yellow journalism, because it was a comic that appeared in newspapers that were involved in that era of journalism. We also saw the first, you know, visualization of comics and what they could be. In the 1930s, that's considered the golden age of comics. It's really when it began to take the form of what we see now. And we were introduced to Superman and Batman. The first comic book featuring original content introduced Superman and marked the birth of the superhero genre. Then we saw popularity of comic books really gaining and growing in the 1940s during World War II. They provided entertainment for not only soldiers, but children. They really allowed us to see what was going on, give commentary, and create this like Go USA mentality. In the 1950s, the Comics Code Authority was established, and it helped really regulate comic content, how it was reflected into society and influenced on our youth. In the 1960s, this is really where we see Marvel start to take off. This is considered the silver age of comics. This is where Marvel really started introducing Spider-Man, the X-Men, and Fantastic Four, some of the like major players that are still going today. In the 1970s, we see an underground idea of comics with an X emerge. This was really kind of a countercultural movement against traditional comics, and they were addressing social and political issues in a more reflective way. Then the 80s brought in the Bronze Age of comics. This introduced a lot more mature kind of comics, like the Dark Knight series comes in here. This is where graphic novels really started becoming popular because it allowed you to have longer stories that were more mature, more complex. Not that comics are not complex by any means, but you could just see darker type storylines come in. In the 1990s, a lot of people started collecting. It became this very like bubble type effect of, if you were in, you were in the fandom. If you weren't, you were not a part of it. In the 2000s, the comic industry really saw a resurgence. It wasn't just this like small group of people that were collecting or involved in it. Graphic novels really started to gain popularity even more and become a part of like the literary works of like libraries. And it wasn't just like, oh, it's a comic book. In the 2010s, we start seeing popular culture really take to comic books. A lot of this had to do with like the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Cinematic Universe. Of course, in the 90s, we had the cartoons, in the 80s, you had the cartoons, but this is really where it started to like cement into really popular culture. We also had the rise of digital comics and web comics. So they were easier to get and they were more available. And then in the 2020s, comic books are continuing to evolve. We're seeing more storylines come in. We're seeing the continuation of storylines, especially in the cinema and television era. And just more and more, they are growing and becoming this popular way to visualize stories. When we look at comic books, there are a few things that really stand out in how they make such a impact on people with their visuals. And so one of them is the page layout. So here is the simple page layout of a comic book. You can see the different areas. You have the description of or the caption of what's going on. You have the sound effects. You have the panel, which is all of them put together. You have the gutter, which is the white lines in between. So it's like the break between the scenes. And then you have the speech balloons, which allow for the text to come through. Now, the page layout does a few different things. It allows for the flow of the narrative. It determines how quickly the reader progresses through the story. So if you have a larger panel, it might slow down the reading pace because there's going to be more action, there's going to be more visuals, more text. Smaller panels really create urgency because you're wanting to get through them quickly. And then this control of pacing really helps build tension, suspense, emotional impact. It allows for emphasizing key elements. The page layout also creates a visual hierarchy. So depending on what kind of comic you read it in a certain order. So left to right, up and down. If you read manga, it's backwards. And then different graphic novels are different in the ways that they do their order as well. This allows for what we call sequential storytelling. Basically, they tell it in order. You can also do aesthetic expression. So this is when it's just visual and they're expressing what's going on through those visuals. You have parallel storytelling. So different scenes can play out next to each other. Lots of symbolism, lots of metaphor, and all of these things really help with reader engagement. Next, you have the gutters and the transitions that happen through the gutters. So what happens is you have the panels, which is the drawing, and then the white part in between it allows for transition, and it allows the reader to imagine what's going on between the panels. And so this is called the gutter effect. And this allows for one, seamless storytelling, right? Because you can have panels right next to each other. It allows you to control the reader's engagement, but it also allows you to like build suspense, transition through things. And it also has a visual impact because from one scene to another, you can have a big jump within the gutter. And then some artists like to do things over the gutter, like as artistic expression or symbolism. And gutter and transitions also allow for efficient space utilization so that you can get the story across in minimal text and more visuals. Of course, a comic book isn't just visuals. There is some text and imaginary interplay. And basically what that does is that, the text allows you to convey characters' emotions, provide context, reinforce themes. But what comic books and graphic novels do so well is that they strike this balance between text and visuals that allow for this engagement of the narrative in a very connecting way. And it's not just reading like you would read a novel, but you can see what's going on and then using the text as kind of a bouncing point to get to the next visual. One thing that comic books and graphic novels do really well is they provide action sequences without action. And what's cool about that is they allow for this frozen moment in time by still conveying what's going on and, you know, a superhero fighting or Spider-Man swinging through the city. And as you can see here, like he's going over the gutter in different areas. And so there's lots of artistic expression that way. You can really get creative with how you draw out the page, the emotional impact of it, the colors that you use. And so action sequences or just like sequences in general in comic books and graphic novels allow for this really great deep artistic expression. And it's something that we don't necessarily get if we just read a novel or if we watch a movie. Like there's just something very special about these frozen moments, right? Um, of course, comics are known for their visual symbolism, mostly because, I mean, it's in visual form, right? And yes, you can have text to convey certain things, but the use of color and visual symbolism and mannerisms and things like that really stand out in comics and graphic novels because it's just a medium that allows for the creativity to really use metaphor and color and tone and expression. This really helps to not only enhance the character, but the settings they're in. It helps reinforce themes and the subtext that the text provides. And when you look at symbolism and color, it really guides the reader's emotions. And there's this cohesion of what the reader is supposed to feel and what the comic looks like. It really amplifies the storytelling, just like what we've talked about all over in class. Like the small little details that go into visuals really are what create the story, right? And it creates this unique artistic identity for each artist as they create. Um, One of the other neat things about comics is that, yes, they are visually appealing. They have so much going on in them. They've created this whole entire unique medium that is strictly for them. But they also have created these very, very complex and unique narrative techniques. One of them is non-linear storytelling. So you don't necessarily have to go in order. That's what the gutters are for, right? You can let the reader imagine what's going on between the panels. You can have multiple perspectives going on. And you don't have to keep switching back and forth between he said, she said, explaining what's going on. The visuals really allow for that. Again, you have that symbolism, that metaphor. You can have characters like Deadpool who are very aware that they are a comic book character and that they're taking an audience through this journey. And then you have interconnected story arcs. I mean, we've seen this with DC, we've seen this with Marvel. Like there is so much story and interconnectedness that goes on to it that you have this never ending pool of narration and stories that you can pull from. You have textual experimentation. And when Stan Lee talked about like the Marvel process, that's kind of where he gets that, is that you can try all these different ways to get the story across, right? It's not just this cookie cutter kind of layout. You can do all sorts of different things. And then lastly, they have what's called silent storytelling. And you could have a whole comic that doesn't have any text in it and it's just visuals. And the story is still just as strong without the text as it would be with it because of these complex narrative techniques. You also have the idea that, you know, comics, yes, they're visual. You can see them. They're giving you something to think about, whereas like a book, you have to imagine in your head. But it also still fosters imagination and engagement because you have these compelling visuals and these narratives, but you have to engage with them. You have to read them in a certain order, and you have to like think about what's going on between the panels. And so you're having to not only read, quote unquote, but really engage about what's going on with the characters and think about it. It's not just laid out in front of you. Through this idea of interplay of art and text and participation of the reader, narrative gaps and immersion kind of fill in. And so you don't need all the details. You can kind of fill that in for yourself and imagine what's going to happen. This interactive experience really helps foster creativity, a strong connection with the material. You really become connected to the characters. And in the interview that I showed you with Stan Lee, there's a part where he talks about people that read comics are avid readers. And he goes on in part of the interview to say that those that like students in schools who have trouble reading, if you give them a comic book, you will slowly start to see them pick up other books and to really have better comprehension skills and reading skills and understanding of what's going on because of the easy access that comic books allow for your brain to really kind of go and imagine and really engage with material. And so it's almost like the gateway of learning to become involved in narrative if you aren't fully ready to do that with like books or plays or movies. Finally, comics, one of the great things about them is that they can provide really diverse perspectives and themes, and they haven't always done that. Like there's a history where they weren't always so diverse, and or they could have been sexist or things like that, and they have really worked to change that perspective. But through it all, they really provide lots of different narratives for a broad audience. So you don't have to necessarily like one character or one story arc or one style of comics. There's something for everybody. They really tackle a wide range of social, cultural, and personal issues. We saw that from the golden age and the silver age of going into the wars and how different characters progress, and the storylines just really take that and really make you think about what's going on in our society and the complexity of what's going on in the real world. And some of those themes, and this is a short list of what's going on, but there's identity, social justice, diversity, the human condition. They're explored through lots of different characters, lots of different storylines, lots of different lenses. And I think that's what's so appealing about comics is that it's just, there's so many different ways that you can go about getting into it. And there's so many characters to connect to and storylines. There's something for everybody. So again, this is a short idea of what comics can do, but they really provide a way for you to take the visual aspects that we have been talking about in class and apply them to a medium that really focuses on narrative, right? Yes, there's text, there's descriptions, but the visual aspect is really what takes the story and elevates it. So I want you to just think about that as we continue on and how like comics can really be a stepping stone to other ways of visual storytelling.